Lieutenant General Sarah Mitchell stood in the corner of the hotel ballroom, watching her cousin's wedding unfold like a performance she wasn't meant to witness. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, while guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled effortlessly around tables draped in ivory silk. She wore a simple black dress, understated and plain, because anything else would have drawn the wrong kind of attention from people who had already decided she didn't belong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 3 hours, she had been the invisible woman. No one approached her corner table tucked behind a decorative pillar. No one asked how she was doing or what she'd been up to since the last family gathering 2 years ago. They simply looked past her, through her, as if she were part of the furniture. The conversations flowed around her like water around a stone, never quite touching, never quite acknowledging her presence. Her Aunt Patricia swept by an emerald green taffeta, pausing just long enough to offer a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Sarah, dear," she said with that particular tone reserved for addressing life's disappointments. "Still looking for work, I assume?" The words landed with surgical precision, designed to cut without leaving visible wounds. Sarah nodded politely, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. She had learned long ago that explanations only made things worse. The Mitchell family had always been about appearances. Success was measured in job titles that impressed strangers at cocktail parties, in houses with circular driveways, and children who followed predictable paths toward predictable achievements. Sarah had never fit their definition of success, not since she chose the military over law school, not since she disappeared for months at a time on deployments they couldn't brag about to their country club friends. Her cousin Rebecca, radiant in vintage lace and pearls, held court near the head table, surrounded by bridesmaids who giggled and posed for endless photographs. Rebecca had done everything right in the family's eyes. Marketing executive at a prestigious firm, engaged to a hedge fund manager, wedding featured in the society pages, she was everything the Mitchell family valued, everything they wished Sarah could have been. Uncle Charles approached Sarah's table with a bourbon in hand and condescension in his smile. He settled into the empty chair across from her without invitation, his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of gardenia centerpieces. "So, Sarah," he began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "still playing soldier, are we?" The way he said it made military service sound like an extended game of dress-up, something childish she should have outgrown by now. She'd stopped correcting them years ago when they called it playing soldier. Stopped trying to explain that her uniform wasn't a costume, that her work wasn't a phase she would eventually grow out of once she came to her senses and joined the real world. The real world, in their vocabulary, meant corporate offices and quarterly earnings reports and networking events where people competed to see who could name-drop the most impressive clients. Her mother, Margaret Mitchell, glided between tables in champagne-colored silk, the perfect hostess ensuring every guest felt welcomed and important. Every guest, except her own daughter. When their eyes met across the room, Margaret's smile flickered, just slightly, before she turned away, immediately engaging an elderly couple in animated conversation about their recent Mediterranean cruise. The message was clear and had been delivered consistently for over a decade. Sarah was an embarrassment to be managed, not a daughter to be celebrated. The dinner service began with military precision that Sarah appreciated more than anyone at her table realized. Servers moved efficiently between courses, while conversations hummed with the comfortable ease of people who belonged together, who shared common references and inside jokes accumulated over years of similar gatherings. Sarah ate her salmon in silence, listening to discussions about stock portfolios and vacation homes and private school enrollment decisions for children not yet born. Her table mates, distant relatives and family friends she barely knew, made polite attempts at conversation that inevitably died when they realized she had nothing interesting to contribute to their world. "What do you do for work, dear?" asked Mrs. Henderson, the family dentist's wife, her voice bright with the kind of curiosity that expected an easy answer. "Between jobs right now," Sarah replied, which wasn't technically a lie, but wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth would have sounded like fiction to people who measured worth in salary figures and corner offices. Mrs. Henderson nodded with the sympathetic expression reserved for the chronically unemployed, then smoothly redirected the conversation toward her own daughter's recent promotion at an advertising agency. Sarah became invisible again, a convenient non-person who could be ignored without social consequences. She had perfected the art of occupying space without taking up room, of being present without being noticed. The wedding cake arrived with fanfare, 3 tiers of buttercream roses and sugar pearls that matched Rebecca's necklace. Champagne flutes appeared as if by magic, filled with bubbles that caught the light like tiny stars. The toasts began with Rebecca's father, Uncle Charles, who spoke eloquently about love and commitment and building a life together. He mentioned Rebecca's accomplishments, her groom's promising career, the bright future stretching ahead of them like an endless summer day. He did not mention Sarah, though she sat less than 20 feet away. She had not been included in the wedding party, not invited to the rehearsal dinner, not asked to participate in any of the pre-wedding celebrations that had consumed the family's attention for months. She was the relative they acknowledged only when forced, the black sheep whose mere presence reminded them that not everyone in the Mitchell family had followed the prescribed path to respectability. The evening wore on with toasts and dancing and the kind of forced merriment that characterizes family obligations disguised as celebrations. Sarah remained at her corner table, watching the festivities unfold like a movie she had wandered into by mistake. She thought about leaving early, slipping out during the dancing when her absence would go unnoticed, but something kept her rooted to her chair. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the faint hope that somewhere in this room full of people who shared her DNA, someone might remember that she mattered too. The evening took a sharper turn when Rebecca stood to give her maid of honor speech. She tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon, the delicate chiming sound cutting through the ambient chatter like a blade. The room quieted expectantly, all eyes turned toward the bride who glowed under the warm spotlight that suddenly illuminated the head table. Rebecca's smile was radiant, her voice clear and confident, as she began speaking about love, friendship, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who truly understand your worth. She spoke eloquently about her new husband, David, about the life they planned to build together, about the family and friends who had supported their journey from college sweethearts to married couple. Then her gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Sarah's corner table before moving on as if she had seen nothing worth acknowledging. But there had been something in that glance, something cold and calculating that made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension. Rebecca's speech continued, but the damage was already done. "You know," Rebecca said, her laugh tinkling like broken glass, "David and I feel so blessed to be surrounded by successful, accomplished people tonight. People who inspire us, who challenge us to be better versions of ourselves." She paused, letting her words sink in while the guests murmured their agreement. It's amazing how much you can learn about someone's character by looking at what they've achieved, isn't it? The words hung in the air like smoke, seemingly innocent but carrying an unmistakable edge. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized every person at her table was studiously avoiding eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their dessert plates and coffee cups. Rebecca's speech continued, but the damage was already done.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The message had been delivered with surgical precision to anyone paying attention. After the toasts concluded, Sarah excused herself from the table and walked toward the ladies' room, needing a moment away from the suffocating politeness and barely concealed disdain. The powder room was elegant,
all marble countertops and gilt-framed mirrors, with fresh orchids arranged in crystal vases. She splashed cool water on her wrists and stared at her reflection, seeing her father's stubborn jawline and her grandmother's steady gray eyes. As she was about to leave, she heard voices approaching from the hallway. Her Aunt Patricia and Cousin Rebecca were walking together, their heels clicking against the polished floor, their voices carrying that particular quality of women who believed themselves alone and unheard. "I still can't believe she actually showed up," Rebecca was saying, her voice stripped of its earlier sweetness. "I mean, what was she thinking? This is my wedding, not some charity event for family disappointments." Patricia's laugh was brittle and sharp. "Your mother felt obligated to invite her, you know how it is. But honestly, sitting there in that dreadful dress like she belongs with the rest of us, it's embarrassing." Sarah pressed herself against the wall inside the powder room, her heart pounding as she realized they were talking about her. Part of her wanted to walk out, to confront them directly, but something deeper kept her frozen in place, compelled to hear what they really thought, when they believed no one was listening. "The worst part," Rebecca continued, "is how she just sits there acting like she's something special. Military service? Please. My cleaning lady's son is in the army too, and at least he doesn't pretend it makes him important." "She's always been delusional," Patricia agreed. "Remember when she turned down that internship at Charles's law firm? Said she had bigger plans. Well, look how that worked out. 34 years old and nothing to show for it except a bunch of ridiculous medals nobody cares about." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one precisely aimed to wound. She had known they disapproved of her choices, had felt their judgment in every stilted conversation and awkward family dinner, but hearing their actual opinions voiced so casually was devastating in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Mother says she's been unemployed for months," Rebecca added with obvious satisfaction. "Apparently, she's been applying for security guard positions and retail jobs. Can you imagine? All that time playing dress-up, and she ends up exactly where she would have been without the military fantasy?" Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the marble countertop, her reflection in the mirror showing a face drained of color. They had no idea what she actually did, no comprehension of the responsibilities she carried, or the decisions that kept people alive. To them, her service was an elaborate joke, a stubborn refusal to grow up and join the real world of quarterly reports and networking lunches. "The funniest part," Patricia said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "is that she actually thinks people respect her. Did you see how she sat up straighter during the toasts, like she expected to be mentioned or recognized somehow? It's almost pitiful." Rebecca's laughter was cruel and bright. "Well, she can expect all she wants. This is my day, and I'm not about to waste time pretending she matters. Let her sit in her corner and realize what irrelevance feels like." Their voices grew fainter as they moved away, leaving Sarah alone with the crushing weight of their words. She stared at herself in the mirror, seeing not the decorated officer who had led soldiers through impossible situations, but the family disappointment they described so casually. For a moment, their version of her story felt more real than her own memories. She thought about the Brahms star gathering dust in a box back home, about the Purple Heart she had never mentioned to anyone in her family, about the citation for valor that hung on her office wall where no Mitchell would ever see it. None of it mattered here, in this world of appearances and social climbing, where worth was measured in salary figures and country club memberships. The powder room door opened, and an elderly woman Sarah didn't recognize entered, offering a polite smile before disappearing into one of the stalls. Sarah straightened her dress, composed her expression, and walked back toward the ballroom. Her legs felt unsteady, but her posture remained military straight out of habit and necessity. The dancing had begun while she was gone, couples swaying together under the romantic lighting while a live band played jazz standards from decades past. Rebecca and David moved together at the center of the dance floor, lost in their perfect moment, surrounded by their perfect guests celebrating their perfect life. Sarah returned to her corner table, where her coffee had grown cold and her slice of wedding cake sat untouched. She sat quietly, watching the celebration continue around her, feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in any foreign country or dangerous mission. At least in those places, her isolation had purpose. Here, it was simply the natural order of things, the way her family had always operated when it came to the daughter who refused to conform to their expectations. The evening dragged on with endless dancing and laughter, and the kind of forced joy that characterizes expensive celebrations. Sarah remained in her chair, invisible and forgotten, counting the minutes until she could leave without causing the kind of scene that would give them even more ammunition against her. She had endured worse situations with more grace, but somehow this felt different. This felt personal in ways that enemy fire and military bureaucracy never could. Uncle Charles approached her table again, this time with his wife Eleanor in tow, both of them slightly flushed from champagne and dancing. They settled into chairs across from her with the satisfied expressions of people who had thoroughly enjoyed themselves at someone else's expense. "Sarah, dear," Eleanor said with false sweetness, "we've been meaning to ask about your job situation. Charles knows some people in security if you're interested in that sort of work." The offer hung between them, like charity. Well-meaning, perhaps, but delivered with the assumption that Sarah's life had been a series of wrong turns that needed correcting. She smiled politely and thanked them for their concern, knowing that any explanation of her actual circumstances would sound like desperate fiction to people who had already decided her story for her. The moment everything changed began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Pastor Williams, who had officiated the ceremony earlier, approached the microphone that had been abandoned after the toast concluded. He was an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, someone Sarah remembered from her childhood but hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The band noticed his approach and gradually let their current song fade to silence. Pastor Williams tapped the microphone gently, the sound drawing attention away from conversations and dance floor revelry. Guests began turning toward him with polite curiosity, wine glasses pausing halfway to lips, laughter trailing into expectant quiet. Rebecca and David stopped dancing, their faces showing mild confusion as they wondered why the ceremony officiant was interrupting their reception. "Forgive me for this interruption," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in sanctuary settings. His eyes swept across the room with deliberate slowness, finally landing on Sarah's corner table.
"Something that's been weighing on my heart since I arrived tonight." Sarah felt her stomach drop as every head in the room began turning toward her location. She gripped her water glass tighter, her knuckles going white against the crystal stem. Whatever was happening, she wanted no part of it. She had endured enough humiliation for one evening, absorbed enough casual cruelty disguised as family concern. The last thing she needed was public attention drawn to her presence. Pastor Williams continued speaking, his voice growing stronger and more resonant. "You see, I've been watching something tonight that troubles me deeply. I've watched a family treat one of their own with indifference and disrespect. I've watched accomplished, successful people look past someone who deserves their admiration and gratitude." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped their quiet cleanup activities, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Rebecca's face showed the first traces of alarm as she realized her perfect evening was being disrupted by something beyond her control. 15 years ago, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom, "I was deployed as a military chaplain to a forward operating base in Afghanistan. It was my first combat deployment, and I was terrified, completely out of my depth in ways I hadn't anticipated when I volunteered for overseas service." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She remembered Afghanistan, remembered that small base in Kandahar province where she had served as a young captain. She remembered the chaplain who had struggled with the realities of combat operations, who had seemed so lost and overwhelmed during those first few months. "During my 3rd month there, our base came under sustained attack," Pastor Williams continued, his eyes finding Sarah across the crowded room. "Rockets, mortars, small arms fire. It was chaos unlike anything I had ever experienced. I was in the chapel when the first explosions hit, and I froze completely, just stood there while the world exploded around me." The guests were hanging on his every word now, their faces showing mixtures of confusion and growing interest. Uncle Charles had gone very still, his bourbon glass suspended in midair. Aunt Patricia's mouth was slightly open, her carefully applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her pale complexion. A young captain found me there, Pastor Williams said, his voice growing softer but somehow more powerful. She grabbed me by the shoulders, looked me in the eyes, and told me exactly what I needed to do to survive. Then she stayed with me, guided me to safety while explosions rocked the compound around us. Sarah remembered that night with perfect clarity, the terrified chaplain who had forgotten all his training, who had been paralyzed by the sudden reality of war. She had dragged him from the chapel to the reinforced bunker, staying with him until the all clear sounded hours later. It had been instinct more than heroism, the kind of automatic response that military training instilled. But that wasn't the end of it, Pastor Williams continued, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. During the weeks that followed, this same young officer took it upon herself to help me adjust to combat operations. She taught me how to move safely between buildings, how to recognize different types of incoming fire, how to be useful to the soldiers who needed spiritual guidance. The pastor's voice grew stronger, more commanding. She never made me feel ashamed of my fear or incompetence, never treated me like the liability I certainly was. Instead, she invested her time and energy in helping me become the chaplain those brave soldiers deserved. Sarah felt tears threatening behind her eyes as the memories flooded back. She had forgotten how young and lost Pastor Williams had seemed during those early days, how he had gradually found his footing and become one of the most beloved figures on the base. She had never thought of her help as particularly significant, just part of her job as an officer. That young captain, Pastor Williams said, his voice now ringing with unmistakable pride, went on to serve with distinction in multiple combat deployments. She earned the respect of everyone who served alongside her through her courage, her competence, and her unwavering commitment to the soldiers under her command. The silence in the room was absolute now. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes focused on her corner table. Rebecca and David stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, their perfect moment transformed into something else entirely. Pastor Williams straightened his shoulders, his civilian clothes somehow taking on the bearing of military dress uniform. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Lieutenant General Sarah Mitchell, one of the finest officers I have ever known, and a woman who saved my life more times than I can count." The words hit the room like a physical force. Sarah heard gasps, saw wine glasses slip from nerveless fingers, watched as faces transformed from polite curiosity to shock to something approaching awe. Uncle Charles's bourbon glass finally completed its journey to the floor, shattering against the marble with a sound like breaking dreams. Margaret Mitchell had gone completely white, her carefully composed expression cracking like old porcelain. Aunt Patricia's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with the dawning realization of what they had done, what they had said, who they had dismissed so casually throughout the evening. But it was Rebecca's face that Sarah found most fascinating. Her cousin stood in her wedding dress like a statue, her perfect makeup unable to hide the horror spreading across her features. The bride, who had spent the evening making subtle jokes about family disappointments, now faced the reality that she had been mocking one of the highest-ranking women in the United States military. Pastor Williams wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. "General Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of military protocol, "I've carried this with me for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to deliver it properly." Sarah found herself standing without conscious decision, her body responding to military bearing as her mind struggled to process what was happening. Pastor Williams approached her table, the paper extended in his hands like an offering. "This is a letter of commendation from General Thompson," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Written 15 years ago and never properly presented due to the classified nature of your subsequent assignments. It documents your exceptional leadership during multiple combat operations and specifically mentions your dedication to protecting and training junior personnel." Sarah accepted the letter with hands that barely trembled, her fingers recognizing the weight of official military correspondence. She didn't need to read it to know what it contained, but seeing it after all these years felt like vindication she hadn't known she needed.
The room remained frozen and tableau, elegant guests in expensive clothes suddenly reduced to uncomfortable silence as they recalculated everything they thought they knew about the woman they had spent the evening ignoring. Sarah looked across the sea of shocked faces, her gaze moving systematically from relative to relative, friend to friend, each one now seeing her through completely different eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there in her simple black dress, holding the letter that proved what she had always known about herself, but had never needed to justify to anyone.
The truth, it seemed, had a way of speaking for itself when the right moment finally arrived. Pastor Williams stepped back and, with movements sharp and precise, rendered a perfect military salute. "General Mitchell," he said clearly, "it has been the honor of my lifetime to serve alongside you." The salute hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone in the room to continue treating her as anything less than what she truly was. And in that moment, Sarah understood that some battles are worth fighting not because you need to win them, but because the truth deserves to be heard. The salute seemed to hang in the air forever, creating a moment of perfect stillness that stretched across the ballroom like a held breath. Then, as if released from a spell, movement began to ripple through the crowd. An elderly gentleman near the front of the room, someone Sarah didn't recognize, slowly rose to his feet. His movements were careful, deliberate, and when he straightened fully, she could see the bearing that marked him as former military. He brought his hand up in a crisp salute, his eyes fixed respectfully on Sarah's position. The gesture was followed by another man, younger but with the same unmistakable posture, then another. Within moments, nearly a dozen people throughout the ballroom were standing at attention, their hands raised in recognition of rank and service that transcended the social hierarchies that had governed the evening until now. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. She had not expected recognition, had not come seeking vindication, but seeing these strangers honor her service while her own family sat in stunned silence was profoundly moving. She nodded once, accepting their tribute with the quiet dignity that had carried her through countless difficult situations. The applause began softly, started by one of the saluting veterans and quickly spreading throughout the ballroom. It grew in volume and intensity until the ballroom rang with genuine appreciation, the kind of sustained ovation that transcends mere politeness and becomes something heartfelt. Sarah remained standing, her posture straight but her expression calm, allowing the moment to unfold without trying to control or diminish it. Margaret Mitchell had sunk into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Her face had gone ashen beneath her carefully applied makeup, and her hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. The woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of social positioning suddenly found herself on the wrong side of a room that was celebrating everything she had taught her family to dismiss. Uncle Charles was staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, his usual confidence replaced by something resembling shock. The bourbon glass lay forgotten in pieces at his feet, its contents spreading across the marble floor in an amber stain that seemed to mirror the spreading realization of his own mistake. His wife Eleanor sat beside him with her mouth slightly open, her pearl necklace catching the light as her breathing grew shallow and rapid. But it was Rebecca who commanded Sarah's attention most completely. The bride stood motionless in her elaborate gown, her bouquet forgotten in her hands, her face cycling through emotions too complex to name. The woman who had built her perfect wedding around the exclusion of family embarrassments now faced the reality that she had publicly humiliated a decorated general at her own reception.
The things I said in my speech, the way we've all acted, I had no right. Sarah looked at her cousin with genuine compassion, seeing not the cruel bride who had mocked her earlier, but the young woman who had grown up in a family that valued appearances over substance. Rebecca, this is your wedding day. It should be about love and new beginnings, not about past misunderstandings. The forgiveness was more devastating than any accusation could have been. Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely, and she began sobbing in her expensive dress, while her new husband stood helplessly beside her, unsure how to comfort a bride who was crying over her own cruelty rather than joy. Pastor Williams approached Sarah once more, this time extending his hand in a simple handshake rather than a formal salute. General, I hope you know how much your guidance meant to me during those difficult months. You taught me how to be brave when I didn't think I had courage in me. Sarah accepted his handshake warmly, her first genuine smile of the evening finally breaking across her face. You found your own courage, Pastor. I just helped you recognize it was there all along. As the immediate drama began to settle, the room's atmosphere shifted again. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, subdued and thoughtful rather than light-hearted and superficial. Several of the veterans who had saluted earlier approached Sarah's table, introducing themselves and sharing brief stories of their own service. She found herself surrounded by people who understood her world, who spoke her language, who saw her as she truly was rather than as a family disappointment. The evening continued, but the celebration had been fundamentally altered. The music resumed, the dancing continued, but there was an undercurrent of reflection and recalculation that changed everything. Sarah remained at her corner table, no longer isolated, but now the center of respectful attention from people who had initially ignored her completely. As the night wound toward its conclusion, she realized that she had gotten something she hadn't known she needed. Not vindication or revenge, but simply the experience of being seen and recognized for who she truly was. The family who had dismissed her for decades would never forget this evening, would never again be able to reduce her to their convenient narrative of failure and disappointment.
Military service is honorable, of course, but in our social circle, success means different things. Corporate leadership, financial achievement, traditional markers of accomplishment. I understand that your definition of success is different from mine, Sarah acknowledged, but dismissing my choices as failure or delusion was never necessary. We could have simply agreed to disagree about priorities while still maintaining family relationships. The conversation was interrupted by Rebecca's approach, still wearing her wedding dress but with makeup that had been carefully repaired after her earlier tears. David followed close behind, his expression showing the discomfort of someone who had married into a family drama he didn't fully understand. "Sarah," Rebecca said, her voice still shaky with emotion, "I need to apologize again, more specifically this time. The things I said in my speech tonight, the comments about people who never figure their lives out, I was talking about you, and it was cruel and wrong." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology without either minimizing or dramatizing Rebecca's behavior. "I know you were talking about me, Rebecca. I also know that you were speaking from frustration and limited information rather than genuine malice." "That doesn't excuse it," Rebecca insisted. "I was showing off for my friends, trying to seem clever and superior. I used your presence at my wedding as an opportunity to make myself look better by comparison, and that's inexcusable." David finally spoke up, his voice careful but sincere. "General Mitchell, I want you to know that Rebecca has been upset about this all evening, even before Pastor Williams spoke. She realized immediately that her speech was inappropriate, regardless of what she thought she knew about your situation." Sarah looked at the young couple, seeing people who were genuinely remorseful but also recognizing that their apologies couldn't undo the years of casual dismissal and family dysfunction that had led to this moment. Forgiveness was possible, but rebuilding trust would require sustained effort and genuine change. "Rebecca, I accept your apology and I hope you and David have a wonderful marriage. Tonight was a learning experience for all of us about the importance of really knowing the people we care about before making judgments about their lives." The conversation was drawing attention from nearby guests, many of whom were still processing the evening's dramatic revelations. Sarah realized that she had become the center of attention in ways she had never sought, and that continued public discussion of family dynamics would only make the situation more uncomfortable for everyone involved.
Uncle Charles approached the growing group, his earlier confidence completely absent. His expensive suit seemed to hang differently on his frame, as if the evening's humiliation had physically diminished him. "Sarah, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect that I should have given you years ago." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I've spent this entire evening thinking about the conversations we've had over the years, the assumptions I made, the advice I offered about real careers and practical choices. I feel like a fool." "Uncle Charles, you're not a fool. You are operating with incomplete information and making judgments based on your own definition of success. That's human nature, not stupidity. But I should have asked better questions. I should have been curious about your actual experiences rather than dismissive of choices I didn't understand." His voice carried genuine regret, the kind that comes from recognizing missed opportunities for connection and understanding. Aunt Patricia joined the conversation, her usual social polish replaced by obvious discomfort. "Sarah, dear, I'm mortified by some of the things that were said tonight. The comments about unemployment, about finding you security work. We had no idea about your actual position and accomplishments." Sarah recognized that these apologies, while sincere, were also motivated by social embarrassment. Her family was beginning to understand that they had spent years publicly dismissing someone whose military rank and achievements actually exceeded most of their civilian accomplishments. The realization was forcing them to confront not just their treatment of her, but their own values and priorities. "I appreciate everyone's apologies," Sarah said, addressing the growing circle of family members. "But I want to be clear about something. I didn't come here tonight seeking vindication or recognition. I came because Rebecca is family, and family occasions matter to me regardless of how complicated our relationships might be. The revelation about my rank and service record doesn't change who I've always been. It just provides context that was missing from your understanding of my choices. I've never needed your approval for my career decisions, and I don't need your guilt or compensatory praise now." The statement was delivered with characteristic directness, but without hostility. Sarah had learned through years of military leadership that clarity was more valuable than diplomacy when addressing fundamental misunderstandings. Margaret spoke up again, her voice stronger than before. "What can we do to repair the damage that's been done? How do we move forward from here?" Sarah considered the question carefully, recognizing it as an opportunity to establish new ground rules for family relationships going forward. Moving forward requires acknowledging that we've all operated with different definitions of success and accomplishment. You valued financial achievement, social position, and traditional career paths. I valued service, leadership, and making a difference in areas that don't always generate publicity or social recognition. She gestured toward the military members who were still gathered nearby, now engaged in their own conversations, but clearly listening to the family discussion. The contrast was clear without being explicitly stated. Sarah's fellow veterans had immediately recognized and respected her achievements because they shared common values and experiences. Her family had dismissed those same achievements because they conflicted with their social priorities and lifestyle preferences. "I don't expect you to suddenly understand military service or to change your own values, but I do expect basic respect for choices that are different from yours, especially when those choices involve serving our country and leading other people who are willing to sacrifice for something larger than themselves." The family group fell silent, processing both the message and the manner of its delivery. Sarah's words carried the authority of command presence, the kind of natural leadership that made people listen carefully and consider their responses thoughtfully. Pastor Williams reappeared at Sarah's side, having finished his conversations with other wedding guests. "General, I hope I haven't caused any family difficulties with my impromptu speech tonight. I felt compelled to speak, but I recognize that family dynamics are complicated." Sarah smiled at the elderly minister, genuinely grateful for his intervention despite its uncomfortable consequences. "Pastor Williams, you said what needed to be said at the right moment. Sometimes truth needs to be spoken publicly to have any impact at all. Your family seems to be processing some difficult realizations, he observed, glancing at the circle of relatives who were still absorbing the evening's revelations. Change is never easy, especially when it requires admitting that we've been wrong about important things. They're good people who made bad assumptions, Sarah replied diplomatically. Tonight gave them new information to consider, and I hope they'll use it to build better relationships going forward. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several guests who wanted to speak with Sarah before the evening concluded. Word of her military rank had spread throughout the ballroom, creating curiosity among people who had initially ignored her presence but now recognized her significance. Mrs. Henderson, the dentist's wife, who had earlier asked about Sarah's employment situation with obvious pity, approached with visible embarrassment. "General Mitchell, I owe you an apology for my assumptions earlier this evening. I asked about your work situation in a way that was condescending and inappropriate." "Mrs. Henderson, you asked a perfectly reasonable question. The misunderstanding wasn't your fault." Sarah's graciousness made the woman's embarrassment more acute rather than less, demonstrating the kind of leadership that builds loyalty through example rather than intimidation. As the evening began winding down, Sarah found herself torn between conflicting impulses. Part of her wanted to leave immediately, to escape the awkwardness and attention that had transformed a simple family obligation into a public drama. Another part of her recognized that staying through the celebration's conclusion would demonstrate the kind of grace under pressure that military leadership had taught her. She chose to stay, spending the remaining time in conversation with fellow veterans and gradually working her way through the family members who wanted to speak with her privately. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: expressions of regret, requests for forgiveness, and promises to do better in future interactions. Sarah accepted these overtures graciously, while maintaining emotional distance from their outcomes. She had learned through years of military service that apologies were only meaningful when followed by sustained behavioral change, and that immediate emotional reconciliation was less important than establishing clear expectations for future interactions. As the band played their final songs and guests began gathering coats and purses, Sarah made her own preparations to leave. She had accomplished more than she had expected when she decided to attend Rebecca's wedding, not through any plan or intention, but simply by being present when truth finally demanded to be heard. Colonel Hartwell approached one final time, extending his business card along with an invitation. "General, my firm is always looking for experienced military leaders who understand complex operations and personnel management. If you're ever interested in exploring private sector opportunities, I'd be honored to discuss possibilities with you." Sarah accepted the card politely, recognizing the offer as both professional courtesy and genuine respect for her qualifications. "Thank you, Colonel. I'll keep your offer in mind as I consider my next career steps." The exchange was observed by several family members, providing additional context for Sarah's actual professional status and marketability. Uncle Charles looked particularly thoughtful as he realized that his earlier offer to help her find security work had been not just condescending, but completely unnecessary. As Sarah gathered her purse and prepared to leave, Margaret approached for one final conversation. "Sarah, I know tonight was difficult for everyone, but I'm glad the truth came out. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even if I've done a poor job of showing it over the years." "Thank you, Mom. I hope we can build a better relationship going forward based on understanding rather than assumptions." Margaret nodded, tears threatening once again. "I'd like that very much. Perhaps you could visit sometime and tell us about your actual work. Help us understand what your service has really meant." Sarah considered the invitation carefully, recognizing it as a genuine attempt at reconciliation, while also understanding that changing established family dynamics would require sustained effort from everyone involved. "I'd be willing to visit," she agreed, "but only if the conversation is about building genuine understanding rather than managing family appearances or social embarrassment." The condition was stated clearly, but not harshly, establishing boundaries that would protect Sarah from future manipulation, while leaving room for authentic relationship building if her family was truly committed to change. Rebecca and David approached for their final goodbyes, both looking exhausted by the evening's emotional revelations, but also somehow relieved that hidden tensions had finally been addressed openly. Sarah, I hope someday we can have a real relationship as adults, based on who we actually are, rather than who our family expected us to be. I'd like that too, Rebecca. Congratulations on your marriage, and I hope you and David build something beautiful together. The exchange felt like a beginning rather than an ending, the possibility of genuine connection rather than obligatory family contact. Sarah left the ballroom with her head high and her conscience clear, knowing that she had conducted herself with dignity throughout an evening that could have easily devolved into ugly confrontation or painful drama. She had not sought vindication, but when recognition came, she had accepted it gracefully while maintaining perspective about its ultimate importance. The drive home gave her time to reflect on the evening's events and their broader significance. She had learned that truth has its own power, that respect cannot be demanded but only earned, and that family relationships built on false assumptions are more fragile than anyone wants to admit. More importantly, she had rediscovered something she had temporarily forgotten during months of job searching and civilian transition. Her own worth was not dependent on other people's recognition or approval. She was exactly who she had always been, regardless of whether her family understood or appreciated her choices. The revelation at Rebecca's wedding had changed the family dynamics permanently, but it had also reminded Sarah that she belonged to multiple communities, and that the opinions of people who had never tried to understand her were less important than the respect of those who shared her values and experiences. As she pulled into her driveway and prepared to enter her quiet house, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The evening had not gone as planned, but it had provided something more valuable than a simple family celebration: the experience of being truly seen and recognized for who she actually was. The future would bring new challenges and opportunities, but she would face them with renewed confidence in her own worth and clearer boundaries about the relationships she was willing to maintain. Some battles, she reflected, are won not through fighting, but simply by standing firm in your own truth until others are forced to acknowledge it. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new conversations, and perhaps the beginning of more authentic family relationships built on understanding rather than assumptions. But tonight, she was simply grateful to be home, surrounded by her own choices and comfortable with the person she had become through years of service, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to something larger than herself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.